In part one, which I'll link down in the description and maybe I'll put a card up here if I can remember, I talk about the Ukrainian Air Force, the challenges they face, their kind of unique circumstances, their capabilities at the moment, what they're facing against in terms of the Russian Air Force and integrated air defense systems, some doctrine questions of whether they're going to want to be more of a traditional, larger NATO-style Air Force, or if they are going to kind of need to stick with the resistance doctrine they've been working with for a while. And then I introduced the F-16 as kind of a solution to those problems. Now, I don't think the F-16 is perfect by any means, and there are some downsides to it, but generally speaking, this is the one, at least in the US, that gets brought up the most. There are a lot of reasons for that. There are also some things that don't ever get brought up in that conversation, and some alternatives that we'll take a look at today. So, what am I actually going to look at in the second part of this? Well, I'm going to introduce, on a very, very broad scale, pretty much every other aircraft that's possible in terms of being exported or sent or purchased by the Ukrainians. That's a lot of them. I did not leave pretty much anything out. Anything that is existing in the world, and there's like even a very tiny speck of sand chance that it gets sent. That's what we're looking at. Both in production units and things that are out of production that are maybe looking to be retired or just looking to be exported by other countries as they move to newer platforms. I've put together a couple of organizational packages, so if a certain country or organization decides to try to spearhead this and maybe push their influence in the region a little bit more, this is what they look like. A few very specific competitors that I think would probably be the most reasonable against the F-16, and then we'll take a look at what options would win out, whether that is the F-16, a different jet, or maybe just kind of keeping the status quo for now because Ukraine's Air Force is still largely intact. Then we'll take a look at drones because I think it's an interesting conversation in regards to smaller countries, and of course with the Armenia-Azerbaijani war kicking back up, or at least some skirmishes are still happening. There is a little bit more conversation to be had there as well. Then we'll take a look at the politics of it all and whether or not it's reasonable that F-16s or any of these other aircraft would be sent. So let's take a look at the F-16 again, just as a kind of a refresher if you didn't see the first video. The F-16C Block 50 and 52 are the most common variants of the F-16. The US has a ton of them. I think almost 4,000 F-16s, different variations, have been produced since it was adopted back in the 70s. So the F-16's been around, and there's a lot of them. That's kind of good, and not really bad, honestly. That does mean that there are some older airframes out there, but largely speaking, even some of the older airframes would be kind of fairly comparable to what the Ukrainians are flying now. The Block 50-52 designation really only means the type of engine you're using, the 50 using a General Electric, the 52 using a Pratt & Whitney. The General Electric, typically from my understanding, has better performance low level as it generates lift off of airflow, whereas the Pratt & Whitney is better at high altitudes as it generates lift off of heat. Once again, very minor from my understanding, but those are differences, and these aren't intermixed. So when an air wing gets one of these, they get that particular block. It's not intermingled. And since it's a multi-role fighter, that does kind of help give an edge for a certain mission type, depending on what you're looking at. But these are kind of just the base stats here. I'm not really going to go over each specific one, but all of them largely kind of follow the same pattern of doubling your empty weight to your max takeoff weight for all your extra fuel and armaments, things of that nature. All of your kind of air superiority fighters are going to hover around a 60,000 feet service ceiling. Most everything we're going to look at has the capability of going Mach 1 to Mach 2, depending on. General combat radiuses can be changed by a lot of different factors, so I'm not really too concerned about it. Cost per flight hour varies wildly depending on what country you're looking at, and general performance isn't going to be drastically different between all of these and is not necessarily the most important thing when we're looking at aircraft for this particular war. All around, though, the F-16 is regarded as kind of the budget fighter that the U.S. exports, kind of in the line like the F-5 used to be back in the 60s. It's capable, is multi-role, it can use pretty much everything the USAF has to offer, but it does have some drawbacks. Which leads us to some other potential options. So the most common competitor I've heard so far is the JAS-39C, or any variation, honestly, Gripen from Sweden. Saab produces this. All of this is indigenous. Sweden's got a long history of doing this. It's actively in production and is the most common competitor to the F-35, as it's a lightweight single-engine multi-role aircraft. Currently, Sweden's the only one that fields them any large number, with about 94 in service. But you also have the Czech Republic using them, Hungary using them, South Africa, Thailand, and Brazil. Brazil being the newest batch of the bunch. All of them have less than 30 airframes, with Brazil having the highest level currently on order at 29. These roughly run around $70 million. I'm not going to get too far into it because I'll talk about this particular jet in a little bit more detail here. But one issue that is going to kind of pop up with any of these newer in-production aircraft is they don't have a lot of numbers that they can really just readily throw at the problem. And jet production isn't a very quick turnaround time. So if you're looking at new variants being produced for Ukraine, you're looking at several years at the very least. Then you have the HAL Tejas from India. This is their indigenous fighter program. The Mark II is in the works, I believe, and they have a fair few of the Mark Is, which is the one you see on screen there, currently in service. It is in production, but it's not technically exported yet. They have shopped this around to a couple of countries. No one's really bit down on it, but there are a couple of possible options out there in the near future, so I wanted to include it just because it's kind of an oddity that's kind of out there. But currently, India is the only one that runs these at about 32 in total service right now. And they're about $75 million a pop, a little bit more expensive than the Gripen. But I do want to really emphasize here, prices are probably like one of the least important aspects at the moment, as most likely, even if Ukraine just says, hey, we'll straight out buy these, the country that sells them, or the country of origin, is most likely going to offer some kind of zero-interest loan type situation. Saab has done this, or Sweden has done this, with some of their exports. France has done this, so it wouldn't be that crazy. And if the U.S. does it, there's a very good chance it's a Lend-Lease type deal. But it's hard to say. That's why I'm not too particular on it, but I will say price is a factor in terms of maintenance, and we'll talk about that one with the Dassault Rafale. This is from France. This is kind of their modification, or what they wanted the Eurofighter Typhoon to be, and when they dropped out of that program. It is an omni-role fighter, as they like to call it, so it kind of does the F-35 route, and where it's designed for all branches and has multi-role capabilities, so it's quote-unquote omni-fighter. But it's actively in production. It's exported to a fair few countries. France has them in the largest number, of course, in all of their air arms, if you will. The Air Force and the Navy both have their own unique variants. But Egypt also uses these, Qatar uses these, India uses these, in Greece. All of them in a fairly large number, the exception of Greece, with 6 currently in operation and 18 more on order. So there are at least a few here that possibly could get shifted around, but one problem with this, much like the Eurofighter Typhoon, is it's very complex. This is probably not the best thing to send to Ukraine unless you're sending your own teams to help do maintenance, as like the Eurofighter Typhoon, its computer system is very complex in order to operate those canards properly. It is a more stable airframe than the Typhoon, but by comparison to something like the Tejas or the Gripen, it's not as stable. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong with an airframe like this. And the more complex you get, well, maybe does add some capability, doesn't really edge out anything else in terms of like a huge difference on the battlefield. Which leads us to the Eurofighter Typhoon, kind of the competitor here. I will say, I could not find a specific price on either the Rafale or the Typhoon, even though they've both been exported pretty widely. I've seen figures for the Rafale anywhere from 60-ish million up to like 120. In the Eurofighter Typhoon, I've seen 70 to about 120 as well. So both of these are pretty complex. I wouldn't necessarily say either of them would go. However, I'd say out of the two, the Eurofighter Typhoon's probably the more likely of the bunch, as a bunch of countries use these. Not only did the initial countries of Germany, the UK, Spain, and Italy originally design and produce these, and they have their own production capabilities, but you also have Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, and Austria using these. So you have a lot of these built up over the years. Spain has almost 70 airframes. Saudi Arabia has just over 70. The UK has got about 100. Germany has almost 150. Italy's rocking about 92. So you have a lot of countries where these are in use, and the UK is even looking to retire about 25 of their Tranche 1s, or their Block 1s, if you will, kind of their initial production variant. So maybe that is a possibility. It's a capable multi-role fighter. The UK has been very big on sending aid to Ukraine. However, these are very expensive, complex machines, and once again, having an unstable airframe does have its advantages, but having an elaborate computer system tied into those canards doesn't necessarily work in the favor of being simple to maintain or cheap to maintain. Now, going to the polar opposite of this, in terms of price, you have the JF-17, or the CAC-PAC JF-17, depending on which country produces it, but Pakistan and China both produce this. It is actively in production and actively exported, with Pakistan, Myanmar, Nigeria, and Iraq having at least orders out on these, if not fielding some. Pakistan operates about 134 of these, and well, I don't think that Pakistan or China would be willing to or have any interest in it. It's something that's exported, it's widely available, it's fairly inexpensive, it's a single-engine, lightweight, multi-role fighter. So there's the possibility, I suppose. A very, very long shot, but it's still there. Then you have the J-10, the Chengdu J-10 Vigorous Dragon from China, actively in production. I'm pretty sure actively exported as well in terms of maybe fielding some people. I don't know that it has been exported, but I know that a couple of countries have looked into it. So currently, I believe China is the only one that actively uses this, but if China decided to go that route, I guess they could do this. This is one of the few aircraft they produce, or I guess not few, but one of the aircraft they produce fully indigenously, so there wouldn't be any weird export restrictions in terms of like Russian technology or something, because they have a lot of partnerships there. Then you, of course, have the American suite with the F-15C, the 2040 extension, or the EX Eagle II, actively in production. There's quite a few of these kicking around. Not only does the U.S. use some variant of the F-15, you have Korea using the F-15, Japan using the F-15, Saudi Arabia using the F-15, I believe a couple of European countries. This is probably the second most exported American aircraft after the F-16, without including the F-35, in terms of like actual serviceable air wings. So yeah, not exactly what they're looking for in terms of like the F-16, but it is a very capable air superiority fighter that definitely has multi-role capabilities in terms of like Strike Eagle packages and having some standoff ground strike or deep strike capabilities. Then you have the F-15 or the FA-18E or F or G, which we'll talk about in a minute. Actively in production, Boeing is churning these out. It's actively exported to a handful of U.S. countries or U.S. allies as well. Boeing has even gone so far as to try to get some of the legacy Hornets, either to sell Super Hornets or to maybe upgrade them. It's a somewhat bigger airframe, so I'm not sure that is a direct conversion, but there may be parts or something they're kind of offering like a buyback program or something. But very capable, multi-role. It generates a lot of lift with its body and its leading edges, very similar to like the MiG-29, the Su-27. Very similar type of lift and maneuverability to that of the existing Ukrainian Air Force. It's multi-role. It's got strong, sturdy landing gear for naval landing capabilities. And then you, of course, have the F-35. As I said, everything's on the table. And yes, I didn't put the F-22. I'm not going to go that far. The F-35, probably the ARC, I don't think the actual VTOL version would be necessary and would probably just make things much more difficult in terms of complexity. But the A of the C would be more than fine. The regular Air Force variant seems to work fairly decently on any variety of runways. And then the C, being the naval variant, could also work pretty much any kind of runway you would need to. That's maybe not a highway. I'm not 100% sure on that yet. But those are kind of the new in production models. What is used out there? What are the used car salesmen talking about out there in the aircraft market? Well, you have quite a few different options. I know the first one's probably going to jump out at you there with the F2 Viper Zero from Japan. It is out of production. Mitsubishi does not produce this anymore. There's 62 airframes in service. Not sure exactly if all of those are actually being flown or if some of them are kind of reserved either for trainers or parts or something like that. Japan, historically, at least since World War II, hasn't exported arms to a great degree, and especially not heavy arms like this, aircraft, anything like that. However, in the last couple of years, they've been looking to export these and some other aircraft that they have, so this is definitely a possibility. It is basically an F-16 that's designed slightly more around the idea of the whole leading edge concept. It's designed with unique materials that the Japanese use themselves, making it a technically lighter aircraft, even though it has a larger profile. And yeah, it's pretty much an F-16 outside of that. A lot of anti-ship capability, which is why you kind of see the C camo there, if you will. Anti-ship missions are a pretty big deal for Japan. And I just like this. I'm honestly, this is just because I like the F2 and I like to talk about the F2. So it'd be cool, but this is probably, in terms of all of these, one of the longer shots. Then you have the F5, kind of the F-16 predecessor in terms of concept, a lightweight fighter, largely meant for dogfighting or kind of air interdiction missions. It is out of production, but there are a whole host of countries that have these in large numbers, particularly the South Koreans have a ton of these. The Swiss have a fair amount, and the U.S. has been buying some of them here and there over the last 10, 20 years, maybe 10, 15, to convert into the F5N variant for the naval aggressor squadrons for combat training. So, light, agile little craft. It's nothing too special. It's very basic, but in some instances, that's not a bad thing. Then you have the F4E Phantom II, out of production. South Korea still has a handful of these. Japan just retired their last batch of them in 2021. And then Turkey actually has 48 of these in service, with them being upgraded to what they call the 2020 Terminator variant or upgrade package from the Israeli aircraft industries. So that's an option, I suppose, as well. It's a heavier fighter, double engine, a lot more power, a lot faster by comparison to the F5. But is it any more capable than the F2 or the F-16? It's hard to say. Then you have the Mirage 2000C or 5F. Not exactly sure what the designation differences for the Mirage are, but there are a lot of them, and they seem weird. Also very popular in terms of exports. It's out of production, and France has about 40 of them in service still. So definitely an option. Maybe not the most realistic if France is looking to send something, but it's maybe a possibility. Then you have the FA-18C or D, or the CF-18, or just the F-18, depending on which country you're looking at. But this is the legacy Hornet. Canada, Finland, Switzerland, Spain, a handful of other countries still have these. It is out of production, but like I said, Boeing is looking to actively purchase a lot of these, and still is churning out Super Hornets. So that is maybe something that lends itself more to the legacy Hornets benefit. You have a lot of these in large numbers, even with Switzerland not having a huge fleet at 25. Spain rocks about 72 of these, Finland with 55, and Canada about 98. The Aussies, I believe, also still use some of these as well. Then you have the Panvia Tornado, which is out of production as well. 50 in service with Italy, 141 with Germany, and 81 in Saudi Arabia. This is a variable swept wing craft, the kind of predecessor in terms of its cooperation between multiple countries situation of the Eurofighter Typhoon. So let's take a look at some packages. And when I say that, I mean if a country or an organization is going to step up and really try to press their influence, or maybe their merchandising people, or marketing people rather, towards an effort like this, what are we going to see? Well, if it's new craft, 100% going to be the Gripen. Saab has aggressively been looking to export this and has done fairly well, even in comparison, usually competing against the F-35. It's multi-role. It's very similar to like more modern variants of the F-16. It does operate in a slightly different way, though, as the Swedes have a slightly different doctrine when it comes to aircraft. Much like the Gripen and the Dragon before it, these are all designed to be very simple to maintain and work out of forward operating bases or impromptu bases set up on highways. They're designed for conscripts to be able to work on them with basic tools. I believe the Gripen has a claim that you can change the engine out in an hour. Not 100% sure if that's fully accurate and if that's probably with trained personnel, but it still drives home the point. This is very easy to maintain. As you see there, you have two people actually maintaining, or I guess kind of crew with the one pilot there. I just love this image. I think it's just the amusement I get from this image is hard to describe. Fairly inexpensive, and with it being fairly simple, the price for maintenance kind of comes down a little bit as well. However, setting up supply chains for parts and any of your regular munitions, any of your fuel, I don't believe it uses any kind of different fuel, but still, regardless. And then having trained personnel and everything. This would probably have the shortest run-up time for that, but as I said, the only country that has this in numbers is Sweden. And I don't think Sweden's really prone on sending a large portion of their air fleet to Ukraine. Bit of a problem. Then, as far as another new option, you have the Dassault Rafale, the omni-role fighter, if you will. The naval version might be a little bit better in terms of handling some of the rougher terrain or being more of a frontline forward operating base style aircraft. However, this is a much more complex aircraft. It is much more expensive, and there are already active orders out on this from several different countries that haven't been fulfilled yet. So, well, France, if they really wanted to, could send some of these off of the line in front of other customers. They could do it. But really, since it's not that necessary at the moment, it would not make a whole lot of sense. Not necessarily the worst thing, but if this fighter is truly omni-role and excels pretty much everything it does, this could be something that would be a big marketing coup for them in terms of trying to export this to other countries. Same thing with the Gripen. The Gripen already has a pretty good backing to it, but any kind of extra word-of-mouth marketing is always helpful. Then, of course, the Panvia Tornado, if you wanted to look at used aircraft. Germany has a lot of these. Now, the condition of them is hard to say, but they say that about 141 of them are serviceable. But you will see, looking at the heavy armor or heavy armament from the Bundeswehr, the actual army, I'm not holding out too much hope that a lot of those tornadoes are really flyable within a month, if even more. But the price for maintenance also gets pretty expensive, as it's a swept-wing design, much like with the Su-24. The more moving parts, the worse you're going to be in terms of maintaining it, not only from a time perspective, but a price perspective. It does also, however, have tanker equipment. That's pretty cool. That is something that the Ukrainians could use. They don't have any large aerial refueling craft, so if you did need to do a deep strike mission, you could. Now, I do want to say the price thing, once again, being kind of up in the air and kind of weird. I would imagine if any country gets rid of these, that it would not be at a large expense, because they know this is going to be pricey on the back end, and hopefully they're kind of thinking that these won't be in service very long. They'll be replaced by something else. Because they're older airframes, they've got a lot of hours on them already, most likely, and they're not going to be as advanced even in some of their Generation 4 configurations. Then you have the Eurofighter Typhoon, for the purposes of this conversation, the Tranche 1 or some of the older Tranche 2s. It's multi-role. There's a lot of them in stock. There are several different manufacturers as well. So in terms of existing export orders, needing to fill those are mostly the newer generations, but you would have the capability to have these sent to other countries to either be retooled or maintained if the facilities are not available in Ukraine. You wouldn't necessarily be looking to one specific country. You would have a whole host of them. Now, as I said, there are several active orders, and once again, for the most part, all of those are newer generations. However, that can still impact the parts, the training, the maintenance, scheduling, and everything on some of these aircraft, or just bringing them up to snuff if they're not necessarily in the best of shape. And then, once again, being a more complex fighter, maintaining these is going to be not only more time-consuming, but more expensive. So if anyone in the EuroZone, the EU, the Europe lands is going to step up and really try to maneuver this conversation, drive their influence in that part of the world, it's going to be one of these most likely. Then you have burgers and fries. Good old America. We have a lot of different options. So, of course, the F-16 is something that's talked about. And for the most part, well, there are a few countries that exclusively use the F-16 as kind of their combat craft. Most countries have other things. Not really any large countries like Ukraine. There are not really any that use just the F-16. That being said, price is also a factor in that. But yeah, it's neither here nor there. It's multi-role. It's fairly inexpensive. There's a lot of them in inventory. However, this is not necessarily the best in terms of the way the Ukrainians would use it. And I don't necessarily mean that in a way that the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to maintain them. It's just this is much more complex than they're used to. Even for a fairly simple aircraft, this has a whole host of systems that they would not have on the MiG-29s, the Su-27s, the Su-25s, or the Su-24s. Particularly one of them being the hydrazine backup power system. Not only is hydrazine very hazardous, that is just one part of what makes this more complex. This is almost in a way kind of a glass cannon. It's very light, and a lot of concessions were made to keep it light. Even over the iterations since the 70s in the A model, it has gotten heavier, but it's not really gotten that much heavier, which has led to a fairly consistent problem with weak landing gear. Now, that's a very minor problem. Yes, I can fully acknowledge that. However, in the last year, so I guess the fiscal year 2020 to 2021, it might be 2021 to 2022, regardless, the Air Force logged at least 3 different instances of landing gear breaking on F-16s. I think one of those wasn't even like a landing. It was actually going for takeoff and the landing gear broke. That is not ideal, especially if you're not going to use external fuel tanks and you want to keep this as light and agile as possible. If you're trying to use it closer to the front line, in Ukraine, which is a fairly large country, you're very limited on the number of air bases you can use, not including, having to have hydrazine there and having the proper storage capabilities for it. There's a lot of things that the F-16 kind of has working against it, but generally speaking, it is a very favorable aircraft for most countries. Then you, of course, have the F-15E or C or E, I guess. A lot of inventory, multi-role, kind of a more direct air superiority fighter. It is heavier. Once again, a little closer to the concepts that the Ukrainians are used to in terms of how these aircraft are used, how these aircraft fly, how they work. But it's bigger, heavier aircraft. It's also more expensive to maintain. It's something they could use, but really, air superiority has not been such a big problem that there's not a huge need for F-15s, in my opinion. Then you have the FA-18E, F, or G. You have the tanker equipment option that we talked about with the Tornado. It has good low-speed performance due to that big leading edge there. Helps generate more lift, much like the MiG-29 or Su-27. For the G option, you have the ECM jamming capabilities as well, which ties into SEAD and DEAD missions. As a naval aircraft that doesn't have a history of issues with their landing gear, but it's fairly expensive. It's a new, modern aircraft. Boeing is still producing them, sending them out. If you look at the G, it's going to probably be a little more expensive as well. It's still largely the same airframe, but there are some minor changes made in order to use the extra electronic warfare suites. And then, of course, you have the Block 3 variant, which has those conformal fuel tanks as well. Then, of course, you have the F-35 ARC. It's stealth, it's pricey, it's new. It's probably a huge pain in the ass to maintain this thing, especially for a country like Ukraine that has to be very budget conscious looking forward. So post-war, they need to know they can maintain these aircraft and still use them without breaking their budget. And then you have kind of the made in China option. So if China really wants to assert their power, say, listen, Russia, we've come out, we've said we don't like this war, but you're not stopping. We're going to assert our power and kind of make you the minor player in kind of our sphere. They could do this. It would be wild and crazy, and I don't think anyone would see it coming, but hey, it exists, right? So you have the J-10. This is kind of the medium fighter. This is kind of in between like the F-15 and F-16. Fairly agile, it's fairly expensive, and it's coming from China. Not to say that the Chinese are necessarily bad at making jets, but indigenous jet programs are very difficult to actually pull off, and even more difficult to have a very capable fighter without extra help from anyone else. Which also is kind of the same thing for the JF-17. This is mostly based purely off of Chinese technology. They were kind of the ones to pioneer it, if you will. This is their answer to the F-16. However, it uses very similar technologies to what the Chinese have been able to take from their J-16s and J-11s, their Russian-centric aircraft. They've kind of tuned them a little bit differently, but not only is indigenous aircraft production difficult, indigenous jet engine production is probably infinitely more so. This is something the Indians are having a problem with right now with the Tejas is that they've developed a fighter, but having capable engines, especially two engines you can use kind of in unison, makes it a little bit more difficult. But they would actually probably be one of the better options in terms of bridging the gap from Soviet-era technology to modern jets, with the J-11 being effectively just an Su-27, slightly modernized, and the J-16, which is kind of the same thing. So, while it would be using Soviet or Russian designs and technology that's been modernized by the Chinese, you would have that capability if you wanted it, and you wanted to stay in that kind of an Air Force. Now, the Ukrainians have really wanted to, but it's something they could do if they decided to. So, let's look at some of the more possible competitors. Being the JAS-39 Gripen. Yes, I know that I did the packages thing, but really that's a country trying to force its own kind of agenda on the Ukrainians. Not necessarily that it's a bad thing in terms of capabilities, but they're trying to push influence. These would be things that objectively would work slightly better for the Ukrainians. It's a little bit tailor-made for their needs, at least in terms of doctrine and use case. But the Gripen is probably one of the best options by comparison to the F-16. Very similar in terms of empty to takeoff weight, similar in terms of speed, combat range off a base I believe is slightly better, but once again, external fuel tanks kind of make that point moot. Has a fairly decent it's got a pretty decent service ceiling, but once again, high altitude missions have not been a huge thing for Ukraine right now. That's not to say later in the war, air superiority missions won't be that, but it is something that it can do it, but it's not that big of a deal at the moment. And a very similar service life and cost per flight hour to the F-16. Now, there's not really a set maintenance cost per year for pretty much any of these, because different countries will fly them in different degrees, in different ways. Their individual costs in country are going to vary. So it's really hard to say if this is easier to maintain than the F-16. However, that is the concept behind it from a design perspective. So this would probably be a little easier for the Ukrainians to be able to spin up, maintain, and actually have a viable fleet of these. I don't have any armaments listed here, largely because all of the things we're looking at have roughly the same capability, regardless whether it's the AMRAAM or the Meteor or the AIM-9X or the Python or the Derby. There's a whole host of air-to-air missiles that definitely pretty much mirror, or if not kind of outpace, the Russian competitor. And then all your strike and ground attack missiles would be very similar in terms of any of these. The Swiss, I believe, use a different variety of things for their SEAD and DEAD missions, as well as ground attack and anti-ship operations, but they all have the same capabilities. And then you have your wing loading and thrust-to-weight ratio, which, once again, most people this is the trading card style performance metric that you would see listed, or at least these would be considered when making that metric. However, all of these things aren't really going to be the craziest selling point for the Ukrainians. The big thing that's going to be a big deal, and this is pretty much with any kind of arms, pretty much everything you're seeing on screen now is the sticker selling points, right? If you have a car salesman come up to it and slap it, this is the stuff they're going to tell you about. However, things that can't be accounted for are the doctrine, the design concept that works a little bit better for the Ukrainian use case at the moment. Being able to work off of improvised runways, have a whole host of different maintenance sites, being able to change parts out very quickly and effectively, being able to rearm quickly and get back in the air, you can utilize a much smaller force to much greater effect than you could with, say, something like an F-16, where you're going to have to fly further back, carry extra external fuel tanks, have very specialized equipment in terms of refueling, rearming, maintaining it. The Gripen, you don't have any of those issues. That being said, there's not a lot of Gripens kicking around out there, and even with these being in production, increasing those production numbers is something that's much easier said than done. Then you have kind of the American option. No one's ever talked about this, and at least from what I've heard, but hey, Boeing is also out there to make money. The F/A-18 Super Hornet is a little bit closer in terms of its weight and its design to that of like the MiG-29 or the Su-27. Much larger leading edge and larger wings help generate more lift, which when you're trying to go off the edge of an aircraft carrier is pretty important. And when you're at low speeds, also pretty important. One problem with that is it does produce more drag, so you have some issues there. Has about, once again, doubling the takeoff weight capability, much like we've seen with everything else. A little bit slower at Mach 1.6. Combat range, very similar ballpark. Service ceiling, very similar ballpark. Service life, similar, and cost per flight hour is a little bit more, but once again, hard to really say. Trading card figure is there as well. This you could probably use in a very similar way to like the Finns and the Swiss use their legacy Hornets off of kind of improvised runways. The capability is there. It is a bigger airframe, so that might pose some problems depending on how big the road is. And maintenance is a little bit more complex than, say, something of that of the Gripen. Is, you know, this is intended to work off of aircraft carriers and have very specialized crews designed specifically to maintain these. But you would absolutely have the capability of doing so. Now, the folding wing gimmick for the naval storage capacity thing does factor in a moving part that might be a bit of a problem. However, if you're not using it, I can't imagine it would be all that big of a problem, but it is there. From my understanding from different interviews with pilots and stuff, both Legacy and Super Hornet pilots really like the Hornet. Well, it's maybe not as agile as the F-16. It is still very capable in terms of its role as a multi-role fighter. So it can do air-to-air stuff with the AMRAAMs. It's got the long-range BVR capabilities. You have the AIM-9Xs. You have the HARMs. You have the Slammer ER capability, which is your longer-range ground attack missile. You have the Maverick for shorter-range stuff. And you can more reasonably, at a slower airspeed, maintain control over the aircraft in order to do those things. Not as good in a dogfight necessarily, but dogfighting has not really been the big portion of air combat missions in Ukraine at this point. Then you have the Eurofighter Typhoon Tranche 1. So these are kind of the used options. Once again, going from empty to max takeoff weight, you're pretty much doubling your capability there in terms of armaments or external fuel tanks. Around Mach 2, very quick fighter. A wildly different range, and I'm not sure if this is with external fuel tanks or if this is different variations, since a couple of different countries produce these under kind of the same guidelines. A slightly higher service ceiling, very similar service life, and a wildly different cost per hour. I would imagine with something like this going to Ukraine, you would be a lot higher up on that. However, I do want to speculate that even if we go back and look at the Super Hornet, I've found different articles talking about, well, this figure, the $12,397, is from the U.S. Comptroller for the DoD. That's roughly about half of that cost. It's pretty much the base cost of the airframe, not including fuel in your country per price, the maintenance crews' salaries or wages, depending on how it's paid out, the pilots, to an extent, the armaments. So this is very basic, which is probably why you're seeing closer to the 70K mark here. And with the Tranche 1 kind of being phased out, that is also possible in pushing that price up a little bit. But it is a very large delta wing, so it has a pretty good thrust weight and wing loading ratio. It's got 2 powerful engines as well. As I mentioned earlier, though, it is technically an unstable airframe. Those canards up towards the front help kind of stabilize it in flight, and at high speed can do a lot of different maneuvers, which makes it a very agile, competent fighter at high speeds. That poses a lot more problems in terms of maintaining it, and not only from a physical hardware standpoint, from a software standpoint as well. You do have the IR camera. I also forgot to mention the Gripen has this as well, that the Ukrainians would be used to. This is a passive sensor, so this isn't going to ping an enemy's radar, but it is there, and the Ukrainians are used to it. So it's a pretty useful little sensor, especially if you're getting in close-range engagements. Then you have the Legacy Hornet, the FA-18C. Once again, emptied to max takeoff weight, doubling a little bit faster, oddly enough, at Mach 1.8. Combat range is very similar, service ceiling very similar, service life and cost per flight hour a little bit higher, but very similar. Your trading card metrics are there as well. Smaller wing with a longer leading edge versus a more substantial one like that of the Super Hornet. Kind of messes with some of those metrics. And it does have the folding wing gimmick. However, like I said, there are quite a few countries that still use these in just a ground-based role and have had great success with them. The Finns and the Swedes use their legacy, or the Swiss, sorry, use their legacy Hornets in a very similar way that the Swedes use the Gripen. You can absolutely use it off of improvised runways. It is designed for carrier landings, so, well, you don't necessarily have the FOD barriers there like the MiG-29 does. It is something that you could still, on a fairly reasonably cleared highway, take off and land and rearm, refuel. Probably a little bit more complex, especially with its age, than that of the Gripen. But Spain, Canada, Finland all have these to a fairly large degree, and possibly would be interested in letting Boeing transition these over to Ukrainian use in terms of a favorable deal for Super Hornets. Not 100% sure on that, but it's something that's there. Once again, a bunch of pilots that have piloted both the Legacy and the Super Hornet say both of them are great aircraft. They handle very well at low speeds. They don't get back up to speed very quickly like that of the F-16, but they're still very capable in their own right. And for most of the missions that are going to make a big deal for Ukraine in terms of regaining territory, they're definitely designed for it and have had a pretty good service life of doing those missions. So what about cheap options? What if all of this is too expensive? Ukraine says, hey, listen, we had a budget before the war at our max of just under $6 billion. A third of that maybe goes to the Air Force, and a lot of this equipment's very expensive, with like one F-16 for export purposes running anywhere from $20 to $25 million for a base model, not including maintenance or any of the other additional costs that you may see. So, how do we go about that? Well, kind of do what we're already doing. Focus on closing the airspace with SAMs, integrated air defense systems, making sure the Ukrainians can not only stop Russian air attacks, but also stop any ballistic missiles coming in, because that still is a problem. Focus more on drone casts, so whether it is individual squads having these commercial drones that they're attaching grenades to, or things like the kind of middling stuff between that and a Bayraktar, or even the Bayraktar. Then use your artillery, your rocket artillery, your Grads, your HIMARS, your M270s for your quote-unquote strike missions. It doesn't go as far, obviously, but you also run significantly less of a risk in terms of damage to the machine as well as your operators' lives. And then, if they need any kind of aircraft fields, make short-term deals for fairly simple aircraft. The F4 Terminator 2020 is an updated variant of the F4, and as I said, I also just like the Japanese design here, but Japan has transitioned all of theirs to retirement, so there's a fairly decent number of them kicking around that could be upgraded to use modern munitions and maybe upgrade their avionics a little bit. But this not only already worked in the strike and ground attack role, but could be even more effective in newer variants. It's a very fast, very capable, heavy fighter that has had a pretty long storied service life. And then you have variants of the F5, the F5S and TH in particular, and even there's a modernized version of the F5, I think it's the AT, that uses modern avionics as well for short air interdiction. So if the Russians decide we're going to fly a mission, have these scattered throughout the country to kind of help supplement your SAM network or your integrated air defense system, to get up real fast, fire a beyond visual range missile, kind of guide it in, and return home. Those would be the cheap options. But what do they really do? I mean, what are the trading card metrics we're looking at? So once again, kind of similar here, doubling your empty to max takeoff weight. However, the F4 does have a listed maximum landing weight, so the landing gear possibly might be an issue. Probably not, from my understanding, but these haven't been in large service in a while, so kind of take that as you will. You do have the capability of going just above Mach 2. Combat range, about 420 miles, very similar to what we've seen on some other craft, but you have the capability of external fuel tanks. About $12 million per airframe per upgrade for the Terminator 2020 variant that the Turks are using right now. This is, as I should note as well, over the F-15. Now, there's probably a lot of different things that go into that, but the Turks decided to modernize their F-4s instead of going to, like, Strike Eagles. And once again, that could be a whole political thing. The Turks are a weird spot in terms of NATO and allies. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But the F-4 has a very long, storied service life. It is absolutely one that is kind of the first to really pioneer from a design concept of being multi-role. It is a air superiority fighter, but it has had a lot of success in ground attack, even kind of anti-naval stuff, anti-ship stuff. So it could definitely do the job at about half the price the F-16 is if you look at purely just the upgrade cost, because most likely the way this would work is the U.S. would buy back some or buy F-4s from another country, have either someone in the U.S. do a modernization package for it, or just have the IAI do it as well. There's different options there, but this is kind of what a modern F-4 would have the capabilities of. Then you have the F-5. The F-5 is an interesting one, and there's a couple we'll take a look at. All the metrics are going to be the same here. It is an interesting aircraft from the aspect that this was the predecessor in terms of a design concept to the F-16. Now, I don't mean that in like a direct program, but I mean the U.S. went at this as saying, hey, the F-4 is too heavy, it's too expensive, we can't really export this to a lot of our allies, especially ones that are on a budget. We need a budget, lightweight, capable aircraft, and that's what the F-5 is. Kind of like the F-16 ended up being. The F-5S in particular is used or was used by the Royal Singaporean Air Force. It was upgraded in terms of its avionics and capability to use the AMRAAM, which is kind of the standard long-range missile the NATO allies, or at least the U.S., use. This would add a lot of standoff distance to the F-5, and while it doesn't necessarily have the best trading card ratio there for thrust to weight or wing loading, it is a very capable fighter that, with a long-range set of missiles and a capable radar, could absolutely work as short air interdiction without having to go too crazy on the budget or maintenance costs. However, the F-5S was retired back in 2016. Bit of a problem, but it is possible that some of these are still kicking around and could be fairly easily transitioned over to service in the Ukrainian Air Force, as the T-38, which is pretty much the same airframe but designed for training, is what the US still uses for its training capabilities, and we have a fair bit of experience training or modifying these to the inversion for our naval aggressor squadrons. However, one that is still in service is the F-5TH Super Tigris. Pretty much all the same base stats, but your avionics are going to be different. This is going to trade out the old school radar, the old mechanical radar, for the ELM-203 radar system that has a max range of about 120 nautical miles. Now, whether or not you really need to scan that far is, up to the operator, but this is much further range than what the original or even some of the more modernized F-5s have. Has data link capability, jamming pod capability, and for its missile sets, it uses the Python or Derby set of missiles, which, if I'm correct, are Israeli. While the Israelis have been rather hesitant to send arms, they would absolutely probably be interested in selling sets of missiles for aircraft like this, or most likely the Thailand Air Force has some of these in a stockpile, probably. About $6.8 million per jet for the upgrade package. This was already a fairly inexpensive jet to begin with. It's very simple to maintain, which is why a lot of countries, 60 years on, are still using it and just now starting to either really upgrade them and push them further or retire them. Now, I mentioned there is the F-5AT, which is a variant a company here in the U.S. has been modernizing to use more modernized avionics systems, largely like digital displays, more modern GPS capabilities, having the capability to input a new, more powerful radar, which would also go with the capability of using things like AMRAAM. Then you, of course, have the F-5N, which isn't something that would likely be used for combat, but it is the naval aggressor variant. So that would maybe serve as a base for us to build off of, as the U.S. is pretty familiar with buying Swiss F-5s and modifying them to our needs. So, what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with the kind of fighter versus drone scenario here. Not to say that drones are a full replacement to an air force. However, drones for a country that doesn't have a large budget and doesn't also have the capability to produce indigenous fighters kind of works better. Now, once again, not saying the Bayraktar is the end-all be-all, but the Bayraktar, in terms of replacing something like the A-10, for Ukraine's purposes at least, very possible. It's about as expensive, if not slightly cheaper. You don't have nearly as big of a maintenance crew. Your maintenance cost is significantly cheaper. Yes, it doesn't have the same loiter, or I guess the same munition hauling capability, but you could also have more of them running concurrently on different strike missions. And they're very small. Their radar cross-section or something else makes them very difficult to detect for Russian IADs or SAM systems. Now, that being said, we should absolutely note here that they can still be shot down by MANPADS, and they have been. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a bad option. And a lot of countries, particularly with, I believe, the Azerbaijanis use these as well, and their war with Armenia, and Armenia really didn't have anything to counter it. I might also have that backwards, but I think it's the Azerbaijanis that use these as well, and that's kind of where the TB2 kind of first got its big name before the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, is it capable for a smaller country? Absolutely, yes. Maybe having some supplemental craft or a small fleet of air superiority fighters helps kind of fill your mission profiles, but honestly, unless you're fighting an opponent that has these massive air forces, you probably really don't need it. And this is kind of the decentralizing of an air force back into kind of a more Army command structure for like smaller commercial drones, like we've been seeing kind of squad-based drones in the Ukraine, or very small detachments of either Army aviation groups or just a small dedicated air force running TB2s or any other large military-grade drone. Something that kind of leans more towards this versus something of kind of the F-16 is a comment that Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz, the previous commander of special operations in Europe, said, "It's all hands on deck in terms of comprehensive defense for the government of Ukraine. They're using every resource, and they're also using some highly unconventional means by which to disrupt the Russian Federation's military." Pretty much meaning that if this had been kind of a conventional war that, say, the U.S. or a U.S. ally Ukraine size would have used a U.S. doctrine, it might not have gone as well. The unconventionalness, the wildness, the wild card play, if you will, of this strategy, of this doctrine, has actually probably benefited the Ukrainians because there's not really a counter to it, and the Russians aren't as well versed in doing the same type of thing. So the Ukrainians kind of have the edge here. Whether or not that stays that way or whether or not we see drones take a different route, I would honestly say is up in the air, but at least at the moment, this has been a pretty successful doctrine for them. So let's talk politics. There's a lot to talk about here. In terms of U.S. politics, the 2020 midterms are coming up, and wouldn't you know it, most U.S. voters don't actually care that much about the Ukrainian war. Now, I don't mean that to be callous. I'm not trying to say that the U.S. just doesn't care. It's not as high on their priority list as maybe some people that aren't in the U.S. would think. Like a lot of other countries that are experiencing higher than usual levels of inflation, the economy is much higher on a voter's priority list than Ukraine. That's not to say that voters here don't want to support Ukraine, but they're really kind of backseating that, backburnering that, saying, hey, yeah, we'll keep supporting whatever, but how are we going to fix our economy? And that's really what the midterms are mostly going to be about, other than a few other social issues as well. The good and the bad of that is the good, the Biden administration can continue to send aid packages as long as they don't go too crazy. It kind of skates under the radar, maybe pops up on the news or some Twitter feeds for a couple of days, and that's about it. But it makes a big difference to the Ukrainians. However, if you don't have a high level of political buy-in to, say, sending F-16s, then it becomes a political issue, and that's not something you want to do less than 2 months before an election. So that's kind of a double-edged sword, but in the moment it is playing more to supplying Ukraine with the arms we've been doing and kind of more to their benefit. You also have the Taiwan tensions. This is something that is very odd because there were rumors that the U.S. was even looking into sanctioning China over kind of their treatment and retaliation to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. That would be crazy and would also be somewhat escalatory. And if you really want to see a country get split and have a lot of strife internally, that would be it. You want to see the U.S. try to play two fronts while not being in war, it's much, much more difficult, and you're going to see a weird return to politics of like the 70s, or I guess the late 60s into the 70s with Vietnam. Trying to fight and contain communism was not necessarily the best strategy from a let's not get our troops killed situation. And while I understand, yes, there's a whole host of things, and the Korean War is different, and yada, 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 the more places you put troops, the more difficult it becomes to justify them to your populace. If we already have a lot of aid going to Ukraine, we can't necessarily turn that aid around and send it to Taiwan in case they need it. And we've actually seen purchases or things that were already designated to go to Taiwan in particular. Javelin missiles, it's a big kind of particular instance there, being shipped to Ukraine because they needed them more readily or more quickly versus Taiwan, but Taiwan's already getting them. So with our current production capabilities, that's something to kind of concern ourselves with. We can't really at the moment be spread to two different areas while being able to put our full attention on either one. Luckily, hopefully, Europe would kind of step up there, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And typically, not only do the U.S. voters typically prefer incremental changes in some instances, the leaders of pretty much every major political party in the U.S., of course, the main two, but even some of the third and fourth kind of vaguely popular parties will bring up is making huge changes is not necessarily the best way to go about things. Sure, you can use it as a goalpost, but most of the time, baby steps are what are sold to us, and that's kind of what happens. You want to talk about a leap, you're talking about the F-16. MTACs would be kind of a similar, maybe next level of stepping up in terms of equipment to Ukraine, but F-16 is a much, much bigger step than that. Then you have the global situation, and we, of course, have to start with NATO there. Well, there's nothing in the NATO charter that says every country has to approve of any kind of military equipment transfer. Typically, most countries want most of NATO's buy-in to do that, which is why you saw weird teetering and tottering on the Polish MiG-29s. Poland was kind of okay to do it initially, and they're like, well, we kind of want backing, and we also want something to fill those empty spots, which will require the U.S. or another country, and then there's a whole host of different political games you have to play there. So generally, if most of NATO is not on board, you're not going to do it, even if you're Poland. And Poland has been really punching above their weight in terms of sending stuff over to Ukraine. That leads us to kind of a weird situation with Europe in general, particularly Germany and France, where energy prices, as you see down there from the Doomberg little chart from Bloomberg, energy prices have been crazy. This is an old chart, but regardless, energy prices have been way, 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 way higher than anyone expected them to be, obviously, because both those countries rely heavily on Russian LNG and just general energy. So the more that becomes a problem, the more likely you're going to see Germany continue to be kind of the stopping force in a lot of this, if it's not Turkey or France. Now, most European countries have said that they've got their stores kind of filled, so the winter should be okay. But if it's a hard winter, we'll see if that actually works out. It's really difficult to project energy usage because if you do it right, great. Crisis averted. But the minute you do it wrong, you are everyone's enemy and no one likes you. And that's not really a good spot to be in if you're the government of one of these countries. So there is kind of the energy war aspect of it as well, but largely speaking, France and Germany have been pretty consistent with their vague assistance. They've been very pro-Ukrainian. They've sent things. They've sent a bunch of monetary aid. France has sent a lot of SPGs and stuff, but generally speaking, they're not Poland, right? They're not sending these massive amounts of arms per capita or per GDP that the Poles are. Then you have Turkey. Turkey is a weird one. Turkey is technically a NATO member, but is one of the few countries in NATO or kind of the larger European sphere that is very open in its relationship with Russia, even while kind of actively fighting Russia. It's a very weird relationship they have. But Turkey is part of NATO. It uses a lot of U.S. weapon systems, but also some Russian weapon systems, which is why they're no longer in the F-35 program. They got kicked out, or they were politely asked to not be part of the F-35 program or forbidden from purchasing more. because they decided they needed S-400 SAM systems. Yeah. So, playing a little bit of both sides there. They have come out and said that they are obviously against Russian aggression and they need to leave Russia, or they need to leave all of Ukraine's territories, including the Crimea. But they're also kind of fighting a weird war in Syria against the Russians, kind of. It's a weird proxy war situation that's not like a huge thing, but is kind of a big deal. Then they also have mounting tensions with Greece, which is a whole nother thing. And if two countries in NATO go to war, how does that work? It's a whole host of just a bag of crazy cats. Turkey's an interesting country, especially in this context. But in terms of talking about kind of batting for their own team, you have India. India's an interesting, kind of just out for themselves, not really in a specific faction type country. Yeah, sure, they're part of BRICS, and yeah, they buy a lot of stuff from Russia and China. But India's really out for India. If there's anything economically or politically beneficial to them, they'll do it regardless pretty much of who is involved, whether it's Russia and China or the US and NATO. They play both sides of these. As I said earlier, they have orders for the Dassault Rafale, but they've also been using Russian aircraft for the last 30 years, while still actively buying parts and arms and things from Russia. So, an interesting situation. They also border China and Pakistan, countries that are very closely aligned, or somewhat more so at least. And they're not super friendly neighbors with either of them. Unless it comes to, hey, do you want to trade? We'll maybe do some business. And then, yeah, they're all on board. They have been taking more of a slow approach in terms of their rhetoric and performance against the war in Ukraine, as the Russian oil kind of boom is starting to slow down. So India's not really looking too much there. They've been buying a lot of it, but they also don't have the capability to store it, so they've been selling a lot of it, and the less profit they start making off of that, the more uninterested they're going to be in providing any kind of aid, even if it is just via transaction. And then you have China. China, much like India, is really out for its own, and has been kind of the biggest stunner in terms of not backing Russia at all in this. Sure, they've made up a lot of trade numbers since Russia got cut off and was largely expelled from Western trade. But they've also been very just laissez-faire about the whole situation. They've been like, hey, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that, but we're also going to do military exercises with you, and we're going to have you at the summit, but we're also going to ignore you and make you use our speaking points and kind of just make you wait for a bunch of random leaders. It's a very weird situation with China and Russia. But, everyone, on a very surface level at least, not everyone, but a lot of people will say, oh, China and Russia are super close allies, but they've never really been. Even with the Soviet Union, the Chinese and the Soviets didn't like each other either and would often get in border skirmishes. And steal technology and have these weird political falling outs, is kind of, the Russians didn't really view the Chinese as a more near peer kind of competitor or partner, whereas the Chinese thought they were really the true communist state, and the Russians were kind of devolving into this weird capitalist, semi-capitalist system. Is a very interesting time. Regardless, a lot of that still carries in today, where China's really looking to be more of the power player in their sphere of influence, as opposed to letting Russia continue to be. So who wins out? Who is the big boy on campus? Is it the F-16? Is it the Gripen? Is it any of the other aircraft we talk about? Or is it kind of just staying the course and focusing on closing the skies and doing long-range strikes via artillery or rocket artillery? And honestly, the resistance doctrine that they've adopted that the U.S. has helped work with them on is probably what we're going to see at least for the next few years. A lot of doing any kind of aircraft exporting or lending or anything like that takes a long time to spin up. Even if you have, like the US does with the F-16s, a lot in storage, you have to make those aircraft serviceable again, which takes time. You have to train the Ukrainian pilots, which we already have programs in place to train foreign pilots on F-16s being exported. But you also have maintenance crews you have to train. You have to set up supply lines for parts. You have to set up supply lines for armaments. You have to set up supply lines for weird stuff like hydrazine. There's a whole host of things. That process may already be happening and no one has said anything, because why would they? Honestly, that would really defeat a lot of the purpose and the whole surprise of maybe having F-16s in the next few years. But this is something that takes a while. In the short term, we will likely not see anything, and if it is anything, it'll probably be similar to what we did already with sending parts for Soviet aircraft to help supplement what the Ukrainians have, because their Air Force is actually still pretty significant in terms of its numbers. So maybe post-war transitioning to newer aircraft is a different story, but at the moment, it's not something that's really a big pressing issue. Which is where I kind of want to talk to, or quote rather, the U.S. Air Force European Commander General Jeffrey L. Harrigan, as he says, that doesn't happen fast, talking about sending F-16s. At the end of the day, we've got to leverage what they have and offer them some unique capabilities to make the problems they're facing and look more at a long-term view. Clearly, they want to migrate away from Russian capabilities to U.S., but that takes some time. Collectively, we've got to step up and understand what the Ukrainians' requirements are and find a way to get them to them and get it to them quick. You just don't throw somebody an F-16 and wish them good luck, he said. That's not a recipe for success, and we want to set them up for success. So, yeah, even if F-16 wins, which is very likely if the U.S. is going to continue to kind of be the global leader on this, it's not going to happen quick. You're not going to have it happen in 2022. It would be wild if you saw it by the end of 2023. But as the Ukrainians have shown, they're very quick on the uptake, and, well, they have very interesting tactics when they need them. So maybe we'll see them in 2023, but likely, even if training and supply line building out is already happening, we're not going to know about it anytime soon. So in conclusion, I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution that's easy, quick, or contextually cheap. Even with some of the cheaper options like the F-5s, those are still aging airframes that will continue to get more and more expensive as time goes on. However, probably cheaper at the jump than most things. And, well, multi-role fighters like the F-16 are great for having different capabilities. You also need a large number of them to be able to really specifically do individual roles. That works for Ukraine, as their doctrine was already kind of around that, with the only kind of multi-role jet they had being the MiG-29. But the F-16, you would just have different flights for different things. So you would have your aviation brigade, your tactical aviation brigade, for your strike missions, replacing your Su-24s. Then you would have your other tactical aviation brigades for air-to-air, air interdiction, frontline air missions, ground attack, harm, whatever, or SEAD, DEAD missions. But generally, you need a lot of F-16s to do that. Having 1 or 2 or even 10 is not really all that effective and is not going to change things for the Ukrainians. Even with Lend-Lease, cost eventually is going to be a problem. As I said, the Ukrainian economy was not really sterling before, and it's not going to be sterling anytime soon. Not only is being invaded usually not great for your bottom line, crawling out of that hole, even with a lot, and I mean a lot of foreign assistance, not necessarily Marshall Plan levels, but even if it got to that, that takes a long time. That's decades of development before you really have your economy back to a very stable working state. You also have to consider that more than just airframes are being sent, which is why this is a complex issue. If you could just send an F-16 and it magically did everything, well, great, fine. But you have a number of different inputs that go into it that make it a significantly more complex issue. And Ukraine needs assistance in the aircraft department, but maybe not now. Their aircraft are still largely working. They've got parts, they've got stockpiles of old airframes that maybe don't work or could be serviceable, but can absolutely be used for parts to maintain the airframes they have for a long time. And save for the Su-24s, which are actually flying again, at least one or two, which is wild. They have a fair number of Su-25s, MiG-29s, and Su-27s. So they have a whole host of these that are still in working order. Well, replacing them with more modern aircraft tomorrow, if it was magic and everything worked better, would maybe have an impact. This is a long game play. This is not something that's going to be a HIMAR that's going to make a big dent in a few months. So, where does that leave me on the F-16? I don't know. I think the F-16 is most likely because the U.S. is really probably the only one who would back something like this. But the Gripen's also out there. Saab's maybe not necessarily as keen on sending a lot of the existing Swedish inventory, or I guess the Swedish government isn't too keen on it. But if they wanted a big propaganda coup in terms of kind of being similar to the Bayraktar in this situation, maybe they go that route. I mean, that would be a pretty big plug if you're trying to compete with the F-35 in the Western world. But F-16 is probably most likely. Maybe not the best, but it is definitely very capable and would be very serviceable for the Ukrainians. So what would I talk about in the future? Well, I don't know. There's a lot of options. Probably tanks, honestly, is next. After the whole Kharkiv and Kherson offenses, tanks are going to be a big thing. Since, the Kharkiv offensive captured a lot of tanks, tanks may not necessarily be the most needed right now, but it is probably the next logical step after artillery pieces. And there's a lot of different variants out there from a lot of different countries that would have an interest in trying to export their particular piece of equipment. Maybe I'll talk about the Ukrainian Navy because, its personnel exist and have been doing things, but the Navy itself in terms of a deep water Navy doesn't really exist at this point. So what would a future post-war Navy look like? Maybe I'll talk about that. Then you have the midterms, the LCS program, near-peer wars in the information age, the paper tiger, dragon, bear narrative, armed forces of NATO, China, Taiwan, or Japan's defense evolution, to where I can just ramble on about the F2 again. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. I will do my absolute best to answer any comments. And stay tuned for the next one.